Ron was raising his granddaughter Sasha and was devastated when a car accident took her away from him. But when he opened her casket during the funeral, he was shocked at what he found. Ron, an automotive technician who was just on the cusp of retirement when tragedy struck his family, had a son whom he was very proud of. His boy grew up mostly following in his footsteps, showing a great propensity for mechanical work. He went to school to learn a trade, and was doing quite well for himself. There, he met a wonderful woman, and they had a beautiful baby girl together. The young family made Ron very happy. Even though his wife had passed away, he was mostly content in his life. Ron loved working with his hands and had a hobby repairing vintage cars in his downtime. Plus, he had a family in the form of his son, daughter-in-law, and granddaughter. He would often watch the little girl after school, and she was slowly developing an interest in Ron's car repair hobby. It was wonderful for him to have the opportunity to pass down his passion to another generation. On top of that, watching his granddaughter Sasha meant that Ron also saw his son a lot. They would typically have dinner together at least once a week. The family was very close and happy. That is until one fateful day when a car crash changed everything. That day, Ron picked Sasha up from school and brought her back to his place. They were in the garage together, him tinkering on the latest project in her, telling him every last detail of her school day. The afternoon stretched later, and Ron slowly became concerned when his son did not arrive to pick up Sasha for dinner. Trying not to frighten the sweet 7-year-old child, Ron brought her into the house and made hot dogs for them to munch on. A few minutes after they settled in the kitchen, Ron got the call he was dreading. His son and wife had passed away in a car wreck just 2 hours earlier. Both Ron and Sasha's lives changed irrevocably that day. She was orphaned, and he lost his only child. They were devastated. There was one thing that kept them both going, though, the simple fact that they had each other. Ron was over the moon to find that. He had been made Sasha's designated guardian. His son had made sure to put that in writing, and had written a will as soon as he'd become a father. So when the lawyers looked through the case, it was quite clear-cut. The parents wanted Sasha to live in Ron's care. In a few short days, Ron was made to be Sasha's official legal guardian. After that, many changes ensued in both Ron and Sasha's daily lives. She moved in with her grandfather, and as a result, she had to change schools. Ron's plans for retirement were pushed back indefinitely, and he rearranged his finances to accommodate needing to care for a child full-time. It was an impossibly hard time for them. But luckily, they had each other to lean on. Having previously lost his wife, Ron was familiar with this type of grief. Circe, on the other hand, had never lost anybody before. She needed a lot of support and reassurance from Ron, and even the community at the school banded together to help the sweet kid. All of this factored into Ron and Circe's healing journeys, and it even led them to a new tradition. Right around the time in the day when Circe's parents were in the car crash, the two of them would go for walks and chat with neighbors. It was too hard for them to sit at home in the hours between school and dinner, because it felt like they were reliving that day. So, Ron adapted. He saw how many friends Sasha was making and decided the best course of action was to lean into that camaraderie. They would go for long walks to reclaim their afternoon. And after a week, it became their ritual. No matter what, Ron and Sasha went for their afternoon walks. It was on one such walk on a dark and rainy day that Sasha found something that stopped Ron in his tracks. Not many people were outside that day because of the weather. Perhaps that is why Saoirse's ears pricked up when she heard a faint whimper. She paused, trying to be silent and listen again. A few steps ahead. Ron turned to see what she was doing. Then she walked off the sidewalk towards a cluster of bushes. Ron went over to find out what was grabbing Saoirse's attention and was shocked to find a small dog huddled in the foliage. It was gray and white with matted fur and very skinny legs. Saoirse and Ron approached the dog as gently as they could and got close enough to see the poor thing was malnourished and shivering. This simply felt meant to be. Ron took off his jacket and swaddled the dog inside of it. Together, they brought the pup to the vet to figure out if it was a stray or belonged to anyone. The dog had no tags or chips, and it looked like it had never been groomed before. The vet assumed that it was a stray, or had been abandoned long ago. Saoirse was practically enamored with the dog by then and refused to leave the clinic without it. She started calling it Pepper after the color of its fur, and it immediately began to respond to that name. Ron and the vet joked that Pepper had adopted the duo and not the other way around. So, Ron and Saoirse's family expanded to include a new four-legged member. For some years, they all lived relatively happily together, healthy and safe. But then tragedy hit their family once again. Shortly after Saoirse turned 10, Ron gave her permission to take Pepper out on walks by herself. She was a good kid, responsible with her chores and schoolwork, and he felt that the time was appropriate to allow her a bit more space and time for herself. The day after Saoirse's 10th birthday, she headed out to take Pepper for a nice afternoon walk. But strangely, the pair did not return in time for dinner. For the second time in his life, Ron waited at home with panic and dread building up in his stomach. Had she taken a different route and gotten lost? Had she lost track of time? Maybe chatting with friends? Ron tried not to let his mind go to the worst-case scenarios. This became harder and harder to manage as the minutes passed. He put dinner on the table and sat to wait for Saoirse. Then Ron got a phone call confirming his worst fears. Poor sweet Saoirse had been clipped by a passing vehicle when she was stooped over to clean up after Pepper. The dog was unharmed, but she had fallen and hit her head on the concrete, just like her father. In a flash, she was gone. Ron felt like his world was shattering around him, and he was practically inconsolable receiving the news. Some neighbors who knew his story rushed to his aid. They collected Pepper from the authorities and brought him back to Ron, reuniting at least the last two remaining members of the family. Pepper was a comfort for sure, but also a powerful reminder of Saoirse. A neighbor took charge of feeding and walking the dog in the days after Ron got the news. Soon after, it was time for a funeral to put Saoirse to rest. Ron was still lost in the fog of his grief and did not have a huge part in the arrangements. The only thing he insisted upon was that Pepper be there at his side. Of course, everyone supported that and sat kindly at the service behind him and the dog. The service came to an end. The priest pushed the lid on the coffin, and the pair got up to say their goodbyes to Saoirse before the wood was sealed. It was at that point that Ron noticed something that left him utterly speechless. Pepper jumped up on his hind legs when they neared the coffin and started barking furiously. Ron thought Pepper needed to see Saoirse's lifeless body one more time, and so he opened the coffin to let him sniff her. And that's when he saw it, the faint but unmistakable rise and fall of a breathing chest. Ron screamed for help and frantically started trying to wake Saoirse up. The funeral guests were horrified at first, thinking that his grief had turned into madness. But then they all joined him in his amazement as they saw Sasha slowly sit up. It turned out that she had been in a short coma since the car accident but was otherwise alive and well. Ron and Pepper brought her home, and the trio went forward with their lives with the knowledge that they would be there for one another a little longer. When a skilled young woman was declared dead after a horrible accident, the wolf she had previously helped refused to leave her side. When the village doctor examined her to figure out why, he rushed to call the police. Tao Shan was a park ranger in the Xinjiang region in China. She had worked for the National Park Service for the last 5 years and was in love with her job. Most of her days were spent cleaning camping sites, patrolling around different areas, and surveying water levels. She always had dirt on her shoes. And for Tao, that was the biggest sign of happiness. Since she was a little girl, she had been initiated into hiking by her parents. The local woods is where they would spend most of their vacations as a family. And Tao had formed her best memories there. She felt safe surrounded by nature and never imagined that anything dangerous could ever happen there. But all that was about to change. Summer was coming to an end. And the end of the tourist season meant more free time to hike in the park on her own. One day, Tao took a path to the south to walk a track that looped around the edge of the forest. She was so used to being by herself that she had never thought that one day she might have some unwanted company. The young woman had been walking for half an hour when she felt a presence behind her. But every time she turned her head, no one was in sight. The feeling grew stronger, and she could feel someone behind her back. Tao knew that 100 meters ahead, she would be entering a vast clearing. Whatever was on her heels, there would be no place to hide once in this part of the park. She jogged through the clearing and reached the edge of the forest. There, she found a big boulder and squatted behind it, waiting. Tao overheard a branch creaking before she caught sight of a furry head poking out of the shade. Her follower was a wolf. Tao felt amazed and scared at the same time. She stayed in place and tried to keep her cool. If the wolf had wanted to hurt her, it would have done so by now. It didn't seem to be on a hunt. And it was alone. This was unusual behavior for an animal normally attached to a pack. There was something intriguing in the situation. For some reason, she felt that there was nothing to fear and decided to keep walking. Tao wanted to see if the wolf would keep following her. To her surprise, it did. And it was getting increasingly closer. It wasn't hiding anymore and seemed to be acting more like a dog than a dangerous predator. As the wolf started walking by her side, trust between them started growing. And Tao got more and more familiar with it. It only took a few minutes of proximity to realize that the wolf was injured. One of its forelegs had an open wound. Despite the animal's best effort to match Tao's pace, it was showing signs of weakness. The park ranger stopped and sat down on the path. She waited for the wolf to settle down next to her before getting her first aid kit from her backpack. She didn't want to startle her new companion. So, she made sure to move gently but without any hesitation. The last thing she wanted was for the wolf to doubt her intent and run away. Once all of her gear was at hand, Tao cleaned the wound. The wolf didn't make a move, it had decided to trust this woman and remained calm throughout the whole dressing. It showed more patience than she had anticipated. And a warm feeling of mutual respect grew in her. Once the wolf's bandage was secured, Tao expected it to leave her and go searching for its pack. Instead, her furry friend stuck with her for another hour. It didn't seem to want to leave her side at all. So, they walked together to the highest point of the path. From there, Tao could see where she had left her car. When she had started her hike earlier this morning. It was a peaceful sight for her to consider. Especially with the wolf by her side. What an adventure this day had been. Little did she know. But it was far from over. And it would end in tragedy. Tao was lost in her daydreaming. When a loud noise came from the road. It sounded like someone was trying to get attention. The young woman wasn't working that day. But it was still her duty to investigate if anything suspicious was to happen in the natural park. She had a responsibility and would not walk away from it. She waited for the car horn to go off again and rushed to make her way in the right direction. After 10 minutes of brisk walking, she arrived at an opening where she could see 3 men in the distance. One was in a car, while 2 others were patrolling the edge of a hill atop a ditch. The car horn was still blaring. But it took Tao another 10 minutes to join the road. The situation was awfully suspicious. And she had questions as to why the 3 of them would make such a racket in a protected area. When Tao finally reached the group, the 3 men looked petrified at the sight of her and huddled together behind their car. The ranger stopped in her tracks, confused before realizing that the wolf was still with her. It took a few minutes to reassure everyone and to explain that the wolf wasn't a danger. When Tao finally got the story from the men, they described that a second car had been stuck in the mud for hours. Despite their best attempts, the first car was unable to tow it out. They were desperately waiting for someone with a bigger car to drive by and help them out. Tao took matters into her own hands, running to get her car and help the group out. The wolf chose to go back to the woods. But she didn't have time for goodbyes. Those people were counting on her. And she wasn't about to let them down. However, it seemed that helping them was not in her cards. As soon as Tao started driving towards the ditch, a truck came out of nowhere and slammed into a side door, sending her car crashing into a tree. When the dust settled and the men approached the car, they knew better than to move Tao's body. That could have been more damaging and even fatal to her. Instead, they called 911 and waited for a paramedic to rush her to the nearest village, which happened to be Tao's hometown. It was a poor and rural area. Unfortunately, on that day, the doctor was already out of town. Word of Tao's accident spread quickly through the village, and her family came to be by her side. People with experience tried to revive her, but there was no sign of life. After a few hours, her parents declared her dead. Their beautiful girl had left forever, and there was nothing they could do to bring her back. But maybe somebody else could. The next day, funeral arrangements were made, and Tao's body was put in a coffin. She was about to be buried when a strange figure appeared at the edge of the village. Kids who were playing around saw it and ran off to their homes, screaming. Incredibly, it was the wolf. It had tracked Tao's scent after the accident and had found her body in the coffin. The 3 men who helped Tao explained how the wolf had been accompanying her. The wolf walked slowly towards the congregation, and while everybody scrambled to hide from it, it started scratching the coffin. Someone tried to shoo it away, but the wolf suddenly got angry and started snarling, refusing to leave Tao's side. No one could understand what was happening. At this time, the doctor finally came back to the village. He had heard the news in the night, and had hurried back as fast as he could. When he saw the wolf scratching the coffin, he opened it to check Tao's body. As soon as he started examining her, he went pale and immediately grabbed his phone to call the police. There had been a terrible mistake. When the doctor had checked Tao's vitals, he realized that she was still alive. Her heartbeat was so weak that it was barely recognizable. And an injury in her back was compressing her lungs, making her breathing impossible to see. But the doctor was sure she was alive. Tao was immediately transferred to the nearest hospital in an ambulance, where the doctors helped her wake up from her coma. Tao's delight was immense when she came home. Her furry friend was waiting for her. The wolf that she had saved had been adopted by the town, who wanted to thank him for saving Tao's life.